Welcome back. In this step, we will implement simple security with WS Security. WS Security is basically a set of specifications which actually try to provide security around your SOAP-based web services. One of the things is WS Security is transport independent. Whether you're using HTTP, whether you're using MQ, it does not really matter. WS Security can provide security irrespective of the transport you are making use of. WS Security provides specifications for authentication based on passwords, based on digital signatures, and when you're using certificates. XWSS is one of the important implementations of WS Security. It stands for XML and Web Services Security. What we'll do in this step is we'll use XWSS to implement a simple security policy. We will use something called XWS Security Interceptor, and we will add a user ID and password and make sure that only those requests with that user ID and password are able to access our service. Let's get started now. One of the first things that we need to do is add the security related dependencies. First one is the Spring WS Web Security. So this is the Spring Web Service Security. So whenever I would want to secure Spring Web Services, I would need to use the Spring Web Service Security. Also, I would want to use XWSS. As I said earlier, you need to add in XWS Security. And if the activation jar is not provided, there are a few problems that I am facing with the plugin, with the JAX Beam Event plugin. We would need to add all these three stuff into our pom.xml. You can find the exact details of these dependencies inside the SOAP Web Services folder. So if you go to our GitHub repository and click the SOAP Web Services folder, it would open up the SOAP Web Services related page where you have the useful links as well as you have the security dependencies which are present in here. I've added them in just below WSDL4j. So Spring WS Security, XWS Security, and activation. There are a few exclusions that we are putting in just so that we don't have conflicts. These three dependencies we would need for getting our Spring Web Service Security going. Once we added the dependencies in, what we would need to do is we would need to enhance our config. So our web service config right now does not have the configuration for security. What we would need to do is we would need to configure something called XWS Security Interceptor. What does this interceptor do? This interceptor intercepts all the requests that are coming in. So it intercepts all the SOAP Web Services requests that are coming in to our web service, and it checks whether it's secure. So it checks the user ID and password, for example. Once we create the XWS Security Interceptor, we would need to add it to the list of interceptors. So Spring Web Services provides a mechanism where you can add to the existing list of interceptors. So we would need to add this interceptor which we created to the list of interceptors which are present. As part of defining the security interceptor, we would need to define two things. One, we have to define a callback handler. So what should the security interceptor do when it intercepts a request? So a request is coming in, security interceptor intercepts it. What should it do? It should check the user ID and password, whether they are valid or not. For that, we will need to create a callback handler. In this example, we would be using a simple password validation callback handler. That's one of the handlers which is provided by Spring Web Services Security. And the other thing we would need to provide to the security interceptor is something called the security policy. We will create a security policy.xml to define the security policy and configure it in our interceptor. That's basically it. That's all we would need to enable security on our web service. Let's get started. So let's first start with configuring XWS Security Interceptor. I need to create a bean, so I'll say @bean public. I need to create a XWS Security Interceptor. I'll call this Security Interceptor. I'll create an instance of this. Let's organize the import so that we can import that. Okay, that's imported in now. Security Interceptor is equal to new XWS Security Interceptor. The things which we would need to do here are these two. Once we do these two things, we can return the Security Interceptor back. We have a Security Interceptor, but we would need to add it to be processed by the list of Spring Web Services interceptors. How do we do that? The way we do that is by extending a class. So we need to extend a specific class which is provided by Spring Web Services. It's called WS Configurer Adapter. We need to extend this class and add our interceptor to one of the methods which is already there. So let's override. Which method we would need to override is WS Configurer Adapter actually is a default implementation. It has empty methods allowing subclasses to override the methods they are interested in. What we want to do is we want to override the add interceptors method. So I'll pick this up from here. I would want to define the add interceptors method in here. So I would want to add which interceptor? So I would want to add, so whenever we get a request, we would want to intercept it and add the security interceptor. Now we have configured a XWS security interceptor and we have added it to the list of interceptors. Now we have to actually define a security policy and also create the simple password validation callback handler. So let's get started with it. Security interceptor. When it intercepts, what it needs to do? It needs to call this simple password callback handler. So I'll create the simple password callback handler in a separate method. So let's say dot set callback handler, and I'll use a callback handler method. I'll say control 1 and it says create method callback handler. I'll also define a bean for this, and instead of the callback handler, specific callback handler, I would want to use simple. I would want to make it more specific. So I would want to use simple password validation callback handler. I would want to use the XWSS implementation. So I'll use XWSS implementation. And now let's define the callback handler. So handler is equal to new, and now I can return this handler back. Okay, as of now there is nothing which is configured in here. Let's configure a simple user ID and password. So what I'll do is I'll create a simple map with 2 entries. So handler.set users map, and I would want to just create a simple map. So I'll say collections dot singleton map. So singleton map is a map with just one key and value. So I'll create a singleton map with a user ID and a password. I'll keep it simple. I'll just say user password. What we are saying is whenever you security interceptor, you intercept a request, you call the simple password validation handler. This simple password callback validation handler, what it does, it checks whether the user ID is user and the password is password. So you can actually add a lot of other user ID and password combinations to this. For now, we just have one user ID and password combination. There is something called security policy.xml, security policy that you need to also define. That's mandated by WS security. So let's define that as well. So security interceptor dot set policy configuration. Where is our policy configuration? I'll create a new class path resource, use this security policy.xml. This XML is, we have not created it yet. The security policy can be found right beneath the security dependencies. Here's the request and this is the policy. This might be a little difficult to configure, especially the namespace. So you might do well to pick the file up from here. It's basically a simple XML, right? So you are defining an XML. I'm saying the security configuration. I'm saying you should require a username token. So in the request, there should be a username token. However, I don't really expect a password digest or a nonce. So this is very simple configuration. So you just need to create an XML file with this specific thing. Create a file like this in source main resources. You can look at this here. So security policy.xml, I've created a simple one. We are using the simple password validation callback handler, right? So this is one of the things which is present in here. Other than the simple password validation callback handler, there are other handlers also defined based on your needs. So this certificate validation callback handlers, digest password validation callback handler, plain text password validation callback handler, and other stuff which is present in here. So depending on your need, you can use the appropriate callback handler. For us, we are actually doing very simple validation. So we are using simple password validation callback handler. Created a security interceptor and we added it into the list of interceptors that would be intercepted by Spring Security or Spring Web Services by extending the WS configurer adapter. And what we defined is as part of defining the security interceptor, we also defined a callback handler. The callback handler we configured with a simple user ID and password. And also we configured a simple policy configuration, which is a XML file called security policy.xml. We created a simple security policy.xml in here, which contains the fact that we will require a username, but we don't really require a password digest. So that's basically what we have configured, and you can restart the application right now. Now let's start executing the request and check if it works out. So I'm not making any changes here. So this is exactly as it was before we configured security. So I'll go to request and say, okay, we get an error response back. It says message does not conform to configured policy. In the security policy, we said username token is mandatory. Because there is no security header found, this is throwing an exception. We are getting a fault response back. Now, let's try and configure a user ID and password. How do we do that? In Whistler, the way we can do that is by just going here, click the down arrow on the corner of the screen and click authentication. What we can do is we can choose WSSE, password text authentication. That's what we chose. And type in the username as user and password as password and click go. Cool. You get the response back. That's a successful request. And let's do it again with the wrong username. So user 2, which is a wrong thing. And you would get a response saying, okay, authentication of username password token has failed. What we have done is we executed a request without a user ID and password, without the header at all, and it failed. And wrong username and password failed, and the correct one gets the response back. Actually, what Whistler does is it creates a SOAP envelope header. What would be in the header? The header would contain something like this. This is WSSE security. That's what we are using right now. And we are creating a username token with values user and password. Actually, you can if I copy the request from here, from our GitHub repository, from Spring Web Services folder, actually, if I just go to the request, and I don't need to enable authentication here. So right now we enabled authentication. You don't need to. So I disabled authentication, and now I'm firing the complete request in and click go. So you can see that this would also work. Now what I'm doing is I am actually configuring the header completely. Instead of Whistler configuring the security header, I am doing it for Whistler. Security is a very important part of developing web services. You cannot just put services on the internet and hope everybody would make the correct use of them. Until the next video, bye-bye.